real conversation, and some hard truths. Gangs, drugs, and guns. Giving a voice to those willing to sacrifice. We have stories that need to be told. We have lessons that need to be taught. Protect and serve. Welcome to The Quiet Professional. Welcome back, everybody. Nathan Romas with you once again. And today we have Corporal Stephen Ludlow on the show. Stephen's a 14-year member of the RCMP. He began his work in southern Alberta, where he worked in patrol, general investigations, and then moved to Grand Prairie, where he was a series crime investigator. This meant he focused on interpersonal crimes, including child exploitation, homicide, missing persons, and sex crimes. He's currently a senior victim identification specialist with the RCMP's National Victim Identification Unit at the National Child Exploitation Crime Center in Ottawa. It's a super long title. And he leads a team which identifies child victims depicted in child sexual abuse material. They also support other Canadian child exploitation investigators in furthering their own investigations. He has experience in forensic interviewing of child sexual offenders and investigative techniques in these types of files. And Stephen sits on several international task force working groups led by Interpol and Europol, and has conducted some training with the FBI and Europol. So welcome, Stephen.
Thanks, Nathan. Great to be with you.
And just so people know, I used to work with you back in Okotoks a long time ago.
Yes, our paths crossed for a brief period there. We shared our first posting for a period. So, yeah, nice to reconnect with you today. And I'll try to keep those acronyms for those long titles that you just went through to a minimum. But forgive me if I revert back to those.
Yeah, I was kind of forming the bio from what you'd sent me. And I put this in here, and I think I read it out 3 times out loud before we started recording, and I'm like, it's like a huge tongue twister. So, but no, thank you for coming on. We're a couple time zones apart, but we always make this work and appreciate the time. So can you kind of start us at the beginning, as we do with most people the first time they're on, and tell us a bit about where you came from and how you got to where you are today?
Sure. So originally I'm from a small town in Cape Breton, Nova Scotia. Grew up there, moved on to Halifax, and prior to my policing career, I worked in nursing for a number of years in Halifax. And really policing was always something that was just kind of present as an interest, but quite frankly, back in that period, as being gay, I thought, that's not really a career that's going to be for me. Had all the stereotypes about what policing would be about. But, lo and behold, sat down at a pride parade one year and saw a troop of Mounties marching in the parade. And I thought, maybe I've been wrong about this whole idea of becoming a police officer. And within probably a year, 2 years of that point, I went through the recruiting process and was successful and got in and got to my first post in 2009 in Okotoks, where we began. So, in terms of that first initial policing experience, I mean, working general duty and kind of getting exposure to a bit of everything. I worked a couple of files that were related to child exploitation. But it wasn't until I got, several years experience and moved on to Grand Prairie working in serious crimes that it really opened my eyes to the extent to which this was a crime type that was, number one, of interest, because it's a complex crime type that involves, offenders and victims and whatnot, but really takes a specialized set of skills and training to really advance those investigations. So, in Grand Prairie, ultimately, throughout my experience with persons crimes, I ended up working a project with the Northern Alberta ICE unit, where I was running the child exploitation investigations for Grand Prairie. And it was really during that time that I seen it opened my eyes to the sheer number of these cases that are taking place, and really getting an understanding for, that it's really a daunting task when you have just the pure volume of cases coming in. And for context, the cases that get reported to police in Canada, the vast majority of those come from the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children in the U.S. And that's where kind of the big electronic service providers, the Facebooks and the YouTubes and whatnot, all those reports regarding child exploitation get reported to them, and then ultimately come to Canada and then get referred out to the various jurisdictions. So looking after those files in the Grand Prairie jurisdiction for that period of time was really my introduction to the area of child exploitation in general, and just all of the sub-specialties that are involved to move those investigations forward.
So maybe to go back a little bit, even back to like nursing, did you have any exposure to these types of, I'll call it these types of investigations at that time? Because depending where you work, maybe you come across some of these victims?
Not specifically in the work that I was involved in, but fast forwarding to my work now, I do credit that experience with me being able to work in this crime type, because it's not for everyone. Between my nursing experience and my serious crimes experience, really being able to look at these cases in somewhat of a clinical way when looking at the evidence, but at the same time, of course, recognizing that we're dealing with people here, and the importance of working on behalf of victims.
Mm-hmm.
Because really, where the unit that I'm in now, which is the victim identification unit, we're just one of the many specialized areas in the overall umbrella of child exploitation investigations. And really, our place in the equation is to take a victim-centric approach to the investigations, because at the end of the day, we have offenders located in most jurisdictions, and the resources that are available to go into investigating those offenders, there's never enough resources. And then you throw in there that people can be in possession of child exploitation material containing hundreds, if not thousands, of different victims. And at the end of the day, everyone would agree, I think, that it's the well-being of those victims that are being depicted in those images that's important. So we're that piece of this, where we look at this from a victim-centric perspective, and how can we find the victims that are being shown in those videos and those images who are being abused, and how can we safeguard them from future abuse? So that's kind of where we sit in that equation.
Can you kind of tell us a bit about what got you really started in this field? So, and I asked that because I read an article here that the RCMP had done on you. They had a few questions, and you said that one of the examples that you'd given, you had a victim that you had dealt with, and you just remember kind of the look in their eyes and the feeling of helping them kind of escape their world that they were in at the time.
Yeah, that's an example of a case actually that still sits with me today, and really that was in Grand Prairie actually, and my colleague at the time, Constable Jenna Bootler, and I were working on a case where some vulnerable youth, some homeless youth, were reporting to police in bits and pieces that there was an older man who was approaching them and approaching other at-risk youth, and essentially exploiting them for sex acts, and was grooming them for various things, giving them alcohol, bringing them for drives in a nice car, etc. And ultimately, he would take them to secluded areas where they would be sexually victimized. We had very little information to go on about the offender, and the witnesses and those that were coming forward were not overly cooperative. They were giving us bits and pieces, and essentially we had to sit down and really analyze the behavior patterns of this suspect and try to determine what was going to happen next and where could we potentially find him at any given point. So we essentially took this information and come up with a plan to start checking some areas where he may be present. And essentially, we showed up one morning and decided to hit the first place we could find. It was a secluded rural location, and lo and behold, we approached this location, the very first one we chose, and we seen this older gentleman and a younger boy sitting near a river next to a nice car. And we thought, there's no way. We just stumbled across this guy on our first attempt. And so we kind of monitored and we checked this out. And sure enough, they get up and they get into the car and they drive off. And of course, we're out in the middle of nowhere at this point, and we thought, okay, we got to keep an eye here. And then very quickly after that, they pulled over, and the man and the boy walked into the woods. And this was consistent with the information we had received from many of the witnesses that had come forward. So at that point, we called for resources to come, but knowing what was potentially about to happen, we had to enter the woods behind them. We were probably a minute behind. And sure enough, we located them essentially as sexual offense was unfolding. And we arrested the man, escorted him and the boy out of the woods. And there was two things that came from that boy that day. And that was, first of all, the complete look of disbelief he had in what he was experiencing in that moment. And then secondly, it was the gratitude that you could just see in his eyes.
Mm-hmm.
And he was so thankful that somebody showed up to essentially rescue him from that situation. And we know as child exploitation investigators that there's children in Canada every night going to bed, hoping and praying that someone's going to come and rescue them from the situation that they find themselves in. So that's always stuck with me, because that in-person, we're dealing with online crimes a lot of the time, but that in-person experience of seeing the impact that we can have on a single child who is at risk really motivated me then, and still motivates me to work on behalf of victims. So that one sticks with me a lot, even to this day.
So I just think of, this isn't like a field that really comes up, even in the policing world. You don't see these type of crimes quite often. I've maybe come across 2 of these types of crimes that I'm aware of within the last 10 years. When you had this file, how did you know to go to this area, or even like reach out to somebody and say like, hey, how do I get in here, and what type of field is this? Because I want to say a lot of people are like, I don't know if I could work in that area, just because of the type of victims you deal with. It's a very hard field to be in, and it's very hard things to see. So what kind of led you in that path, and how did you figure out to, that you want to be in there?
Yeah, for me, in this example, there was not an online component. It was an in-person situation, but it certainly kind of demonstrated the importance that our work can have on those individual victims, because clearly young people, children are some of our most vulnerable segments of our population, and between that experience and then really helping with that's really where it started, was just helping with child exploitation investigations that were being led out of the Northern Alberta ICE unit, and then taking on those investigations for Grand Prairie. It was kind of an easing into the crime type, I guess you could say. And it really, a lot of the components are in those investigations are complemented by the experience I had already gained in various persons crimes. Because generally speaking, when we look at the kind of the umbrella of child exploitation, it's describing the sexual abuse of children, where it's the recordings of that abuse, the images and the videos that are then distributed online and shared amongst offenders. That is the kind of the core piece of this. And you're right. I think it's an area that, until you're exposed to it, or you have an understanding of really the magnitude of these crimes, a lot of people do wonder. And really, it's about really that exposure, I think, to this crime type. I don't know if people realize, I mean, even here in Canada, we have, I think now, in excess of 55 child exploitation units across Canada. And that's, between RCMP, provincial and municipal policing agencies. There's 55 units, and there's complexities around this crime type. that really make it important that those ICE units are supported by specialized units, whether it's a unit like mine or whether it's covert operations and technical operations and things like that. So it's really about that exposure. And I think generally, unless you are exposed to it or you have knowledge around what it all consists of, not necessarily something or an area that people would choose without really having that background information.
Well, and just the complexity of it. I know dealing with online stuff, if even just dealing with basic frauds, it's a giant nightmare to do anything online. But how many, could you kind of ballpark what it would take for one of these investigations when you talk maybe personnel wise, how many people might be involved in one investigation, or how many units or even services?
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly a wide range of the types of cases that kind of fall within the child exploitation umbrella. And those could range from, for example, a child being groomed online to provide images of themselves partaking in a sexual activity, where it's a relatively simple scenario in the sense that you have one offender, one victim, and the goal is to determine who both of those people are to ensure that that is not continuing, and also hopefully hold that person accountable. But on the other spectrum, we have, like most organized crime, there are networks online, including on the dark web, of which I'm not a specialist in that particular area. But these organized crime groups, like many others, work on a hierarchy, and for them, new child exploitation material is like currency. They're looking to increase their status within these groups and take on new roles within the groups. And the scary part of that is that in order to obtain new material, you need new victims. So by being aware and knowing what these offenders are looking for, that is one of the challenges, because we have to adapt to that if we want to protect victims that are currently being victimized and hopefully prevent the magnitude of the additional victims that may be at risk. And those, I mean, that's just one kind of piece of the complexity. And in those situations where you have encryption to deal with, you have, just the anonymity in general, you have these offenders who are planning and figuring out ways to not be detected by law enforcement. So in those situations, you're going to have, your ICE units, you're going to have your victim identification, you're going to have your covert operations, you're going to have your forensic technology units. And then depending on where these offenders are located, you're going to have transnational sex offender units, and you're working with, border services and partners in other countries. And really, when it comes to this crime type in general, and specifically with victim identification, it's those partnerships with colleagues around the world that really help to bring these investigations together so that we can identify those victims. I use the analogy that it's really, imagine somebody just passing you a photo of anything and saying, okay, you need to find out where in the world that photo was taken, and really having nothing else to go on. So for us, this could be an image of a child being sexually abused, and we see that the crime has occurred, and our fear is always that it's new and that the child has not been previously identified. Where do you start? And for us, it's really starting with that global collaboration and working with our partners to, number one, figure out where in the world this, what region, which country this could be happening in. And then once we determine which country it's happening in, okay, which province, now which city, which town, which location, and really working to find that specific location, because once we find the location, we have a much better chance of finding that specific victim and making sure that they're safeguarded.
One thing I want to go back to, you're saying there's like a almost a hierarchy within these networks. So do they operate maybe similar to like an organized crime ring? And are they kind of do you attack them in that sense? Like, do you go after the kind of the head of the snake, or do you always have to kind of work from the bottom up?
No, generally speaking, it's very similar to what you're describing there. Now, my unit specifically, we don't lead that part of it, because our interest, again, coming from the victim-centric approach, is finding where the victims that are being depicted in the images being shared by those networks may be located, and if that then contributes to finding out where that material is being produced, and if that producer is part of a network, great. But you're absolutely right. These are not unlike other organized crime networks where there's motivations, beyond just victimizing the child. There's then status and whatnot, and now with the ability of the internet to allow offenders to obtain child exploitation material from children without ever having to be in their physical presence, just highlights the magnitude and the volume of this material that can be produced. And that's when it comes down to one of our biggest hurdles, really, as law enforcement, is this material will be distributed to people in countries all around the world. And the difficult part is we could have images of a child being abused here in Canada, and those images will show up in seizures and in investigations in a dozen other countries. And we don't want investigators in those countries to have to, start and initiate investigations to try to find that child when, hey, we've already found that child here in Canada, and vice versa. We don't want to put effort into, trying to find a child who's already been identified in another country. So that collaboration, that deconfliction, is so important in victim identification, just because of the sheer volume of victims that we're dealing with. So yeah, it's a big struggle in that way.
When these investigations are ongoing, are you you're on the victim side of things, but are you still informed as to who actually gets arrested in the end, or what charges come out of it, or do you just kind of you're one part of the 10 things that are involved in this, and then you're on to the next?
Yeah, for the most part, yes, we're completing the tasks that we need to, and from the victim identification perspective. However, that collaboration that I speak of in terms of being able to come together for deconfliction and just share investigational skills with other countries, really the focal point for that is through Interpol's child sexual exploitation database. And that's really an investigational tool that allows, I think there's over 65 countries now who are connected to this platform. And that's where we get to collaborate and deconflict and work together to determine where these children are located and ultimately locate them, to safeguard them. So, for example, we could have images, that we're trying to determine where that child would be. We may have a little bit of information pertaining, what we can figure out regarding those images, and then an investigator in Germany might have something else to add, an investigator in Australia or the US, the UK, and it's that piling on of skill sets and techniques that when you layer it all together, finally allows you to figure out where that victim is located. Then it's up to the local jurisdiction to push that investigation forward to find the victim, of course, but also to see if there's any chance of locating the offender as well. And in those cases, we do get the information back through this platform about the general resolution. Was the victim finally found? Was there an offender located and identified? And what is the extent of their crimes, really?
So, and I know we're talking mostly about the victim side of things. So maybe these couple questions I have here will be real quick, because maybe you don't even have an answer. But
sure.
Just talking about the perpetrators, the accused, and where, what do you see any kind of themes or commonalities among the people that are involved in this? Like, could it be, is there a frequent type of employment they have, a frequent type of social status? Is it location based?
Yeah, there's no general, I think, profile per se that we'd be approaching it from in terms of who's victimizing which children. We do know that the pandemic certainly emphasized the need and for resources in this area, because with so many children at home during the pandemic and offenders as well, we're seeing kind of the aftermath of that now, where people who are at home with the time and the access to the internet, and for the children, unsupervised time, that people did have more ability to target children. But in terms of any particular, social status, etc., just anecdotally, I have not seen any particular profile stand out. But I'm sure there's probably research that would perhaps outline that a little bit better than I could speak to today.
Do you see big? Are they generally big org crime network type files, or do you get more of the, this one person or a couple people are doing it, and you just have like a bunch of little cells of it? Because I'm thinking, Epstein Island, and lots of people know that because there's a million documentaries on it and stuff. But like, I don't imagine that's an everyday thing. Not lots of people have islands, but it's just, I don't think that's like a real easy undertaking to kind of set up.
It really spans the full gamut of scenarios, unfortunately. And these are not, kind of to your point, these are not the everyday, files that we would be seeing in terms of that level of organization. Although that exists, and there's units that specifically target those networks in hopes of essentially shutting down those networks. And then it's what comes from those networks, the media, for example, that comes from that then leads us to start digging into, well, who have been the victims of these offenders, and how are we going to determine where those victims are? And a lot of times it's the outcomes of the victim identification portion that can then support, prosecutions down the road when, someone who has been, an offender who has been identified and charged, for example, if that investigating agency can confirm that, they have either victimized or shared material associated to X number of victims, and those victims could be anywhere in the world. And if we're assisting an investigation by identifying children either in Canada or abroad, then that can help support that investigation overall. But it definitely runs the full gamut from single individuals who are targeting children online to single individuals who are targeting them in person and recording the abuse, to these more organized networks who are targeting in a vast array of ways.
Yeah, well, and I'm just thinking of like how you're explaining the investigation, and you're looking at more from the victim side, and you can use the victim as the path to finding the perpetrator, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's not really a common way of thinking about things. I just think like, you deal with a theft. Well, you're looking at the suspect's clothing and you're trying to find where they went or something. It's always focused on the bad guy, but using the victim as like a different means to the end. It's a different way of thinking. Maybe it would help in a lot of other investigations.
Well, in these cases, that's really the difference, and you've touched on it there. In that, when we're often just starting with, let's say, an image or a video, what we're starting with is the evidence. We can see the crime unfolding. A lot of crime types, you're starting perhaps at the crime scene,
mm-hmm.
and the investigation stems from there, and it works out, and you start gathering evidence from that point. In our work in victim identification, we're starting with the evidence, and we're essentially working backwards to try to find where that crime scene is. And it's finding that crime scene that can, in most cases, our goal is to find the crime scene so that we can then find the child who was at that scene. So it's essentially working backwards from the evidence back to the crime scene versus some crime types where you're starting with the crime scene and working outwards.
So in talking about the victims,
Yeah.
do you see any kind of general themes among the victims? So any characteristics, maybe social status, maybe they have certain type of employment. So where do we find the victims, and what's kind of the common theme with them?
Yeah, again, there's a full range there, and it's really, like any group when we're talking about any vulnerable population, the more vulnerable they are, the more at risk they are. So in our case, when we're prioritizing and doing risk assessments, essentially the younger the child, the higher the risk. So if we have toddlers, babies who are being sexually abused, who can't speak for themselves, obviously that would be a higher priority to locate those victims versus, not that it's any less serious, but if there's crimes being committed against, and let's say teenagers are sharing material with other people online, still not good. But our focus in that would be to look for the most vulnerable victim who can't speak for themselves. And generally, I think the takeaway in terms of any particular age group or involvement that children have, it's generally speaking, the younger children who are being targeted online are typically going to be using like a tablet, for example, using apps that most people would think are safe, like YouTube and TikTok and things like that. Those are typically going to be younger children who are involved in being targeted on those platforms. Versus as you get older, when children start being old enough to use a cell phone, for example, the apps and whatnot that are going to be involved are going to be those that are focused on communication. And today, so much communication is encrypted, for example, that it leaves few avenues sometimes for investigation when they are being targeted, because often, this is the reality today, is that these children of any age really can be targeted, and they think they're talking to someone perhaps that is of a similar age, because offenders will portray themselves as a teenager or as a child with similar interests to gain that trust and groom them, and eventually try to obtain, explicit material from them for their own purposes. And that brings us into a whole kind of other area that is just really taking off as of late, and we're seeing it, and that's the area of sextortion, where children are being targeted online. They gain some trust with this person that they think they now know, and then they get extorted for more images and more images and more images, and the child, is potentially afraid to disclose anything, thinking they're going to be in trouble. And we're really seeing that take off, especially from the pandemic onwards. Now we're really seeing how that's taken off more than what we've seen in previous years. So that's I wouldn't call it emerging because it's been around for a while, but it's certainly playing a bigger part in a lot of the cases that we see coming forward.
Well, and I'm just thinking at the ground level of things, we would see that, like say you're in patrol, that comes up a lot in high school. Somebody sends a naked picture, and now they're, I'm going to send this to everybody if you don't do this for me. So yeah, that's about the extent I've ever seen it. But when you do these investigations, if somebody's getting extorted with that, is there a way to make sure those pictures don't get out, or can you pull them back off of the internet, or is it's once it's out there, kind of like everyone says, once it's out there, it's out there?
Yeah, I think generally speaking, that is the reality, that once it's out there, there's no way to know for certain that it's only been shared the once, for example. But we have partners here in Canada. One of the resources available to people in Canada is the cybertip.ca, and Cybertip has initiatives where they have the ability to go and essentially, I'll call it scan the internet for particular images that have been reported, and then send notices to those websites to say, listen, that image that you have is considered child exploitation, and ask that it be removed. So there are mechanisms out there, and we partner with these agencies from a law enforcement perspective where appropriate to support that. So there are some ways to help mitigate, and like many things, the earlier the better.
Mm-hmm.
But it really, generally that is the overall concern, is that once it is shared, you don't know where it's going from there. And it's really that, that sharing amongst peers, which on a risk perspective may be lower risk, but until it gets distributed further, and then it ends up in the wrong hands. Unfortunately, we also see that it, in that range of what would be initially seen as innocent images per se, that also carries over to social media, where we have offenders who will go online to someone's Facebook page, who, maybe the Facebook user has posted some innocent images of their children, and offenders will capture those images, and they'll use technology, they'll use software to, take the face of that child and put it on child abuse material and make new material out of it. And then now we have that face on a new body and have abuse taking place, when it's never actually that child who's physically abused,
Mm-hmm.
but now their image is out there. So there's so many situations where innocent situations where offenders will look for opportunities to exploit really where you're least expecting it.
Wow, I never even knew that was a thing. It's kind of, what do they call it? A deep fake, where you put someone else's face into a video.
Yeah, and deep fakes is another area that is taking off. So, whether it's using, Photoshop to simply kind of cut and paste a face from one photo to another to make new material, or whether it's, getting into the deep fakes, that's another area that's of course taking off, because really in this crime type, nothing is off limits, unfortunately.
So do you find a lot of the stuff is shared on social media, like this Facebook, Instagram, like all these people can actually just go on there and find child pornography images or videos?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. It's, if I pulled a few numbers here, actually for today. And if we look at 2021, 2022, like that fiscal year, our national center received over 81,000 complaints during that 1 year period. And these are all, majority of these are all social media platforms. So Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, Google, all the main ones. And that's actually a 56% increase to the year prior. So those 80 plus thousand reports that are received in a year, those are just social media. That's just one component under this child exploitation umbrella that we're dealing with.
Mm-hmm.
So and that's just Canada. That's 81,000 reports from service providers in the U.S., because that's coming from the U.S. And then, of course, you have there are some smaller Canadian companies who are also reporting as well. So, just spitballing here, but probably, roughly 100,000 reports per year just from social media platforms for Canada. So again, the sheer number that we're dealing with is just, it's daunting.
That's crazy to fathom that the number is so high. And I was reading an article just because I know pornography websites have come up in these discussions of, that would be the first place I would think some of this stuff would get shared. And there was one here about Pornhub. They were running a chat bot to, I guess, if somebody types in a certain word, it would pop up this chat bot, and basically it would kind of direct these people saying like, hey, you're looking up stuff that's not allowed. Here's some helplines. Here's online support. So I thought, that's kind of an interesting idea. I mean, if police can't get to every single thing, do we have other partners out there that are working on, protecting some of these people. So are you aware of like a lot of these other programs, and
Yeah.
are they helpful at all?
Yeah. So, I mean, generally speaking, we do have mandatory reporting laws in Canada. So regardless of what type of site a company may be running, what type of app, etc., if they're aware that that material exists, it does need to be reported. Surprisingly, it's not pornography sites that are a big problem in this particular crime type in terms of the frequency of this occurring. And actually, it brings me to the point that you'll notice today I have not used the term child pornography yet, despite the fact that our criminal code, the offenses surrounding child exploitation are child pornography when it comes to producing, distributing, and possessing it. But in this crime type and working with our colleagues, we do use the term child sexual abuse material, child sexual exploitation material. And we internationally, it's not accepted to even use the word pornography when you're talking about child exploitation. But pornography is a term that's used to describe adults engaging in typically consensual sexual acts. And it's typically of a legal nature.
Okay.
But children whose abuse has been recorded, they need our protection and respect, and therefore their abuse shouldn't be reduced to the word porn or such terms. And really, if we ever hear, and my message today to anyone listening would be, if you ever hear the word child porn or kiddie porn, we really should be cringing at the fact that we're using the term pornography when we're talking about the abuse and the recording of sexual abuse of children. So just a little piece there on that. But yeah, definitely when it comes to the mandatory reporting, that is beneficial across the board, regardless of what type of site is being run. And we do get some reports from there. But yeah, interestingly enough, it's not adult pornography websites that we see a lot coming from.
Okay. And I was just looking at some of the stats that are listed out there. These are just generalized stats, but I imagine you might have some better ones. How many investigations do you become involved with in a year?
Oh, for the exact number of investigations, I wouldn't have offhand. It's definitely in the hundreds, but I will. What I do have. Generally, I spoke earlier about the our collaboration tool with Interpol. And those are 65 plus countries who collaborate to identify victims. And since its inception, which I believe was around 2015, there's been over 30,000 victims identified globally. And that's an average of 7 victims a day, I think, is the current number. But here in Canada, for example, last year in 2021, investigators in Canada identified 330 victims. And I did a check here, so leading up to just last month, October of this year, we're at 380 Canadian victims identified. So we're above last year's numbers, and unfortunately, this will be probably a record year for the number of victims identified. Now, there's various factors at play there. We know we are seeing generally, and the numbers will paint a better picture, I think, in time to come on what effect the pandemic has had on the number of victims in Canada. But also, we're getting better at resourcing these files, increasing resources with victim identification. So I think there's a few factors there that can lead to that higher number. But so far this year for 2022, we're at 380 victims that have been identified. And we know that that's a drop in the bucket compared to the full volume of cases that are out there. But that's really, it's demonstrating that the scope of what we're dealing with. So we're over 1 a day just here in Canada.
Well, and just the sheer number of pictures you're talking about, we're tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of pictures, and then there's probably that many victims. And there's just always like a wave of new stuff coming in. Do you work at all on historical stuff, or is it just if a picture kind of comes up and somehow gets matched, then you look to the past, or do you have a historical unit that works on this stuff?
Yeah, the priority will always be, as mentioned earlier, offenders are looking for new material. So new material will naturally put at risk new victims. So that will take priority. But unfortunately, we do see offenders who have, been offending over long periods of time where sometimes we'll identify victims in images. And by the time that identification is made, they're now adults and had no idea that their material was ever even distributed.
Wow.
So not a call that someone likes to receive, or a visit saying, "Hey, is this you?" Because this material has been around. Now, that's not as common as the new material that's coming in, but it does happen because often, because you're dealing with digital media, you don't necessarily know when those images were taken. So we do end up investigating some historical cases that by the time you actually identify the person, you had no idea it was actually historical, but valuable nonetheless, because this may lead to an offender who is still offending, and it can help bring some closure perhaps to an individual who knows that they were, let's say, sexually abused, but didn't realize the scope of perhaps that offender's offending. So the historical part does play a role, but in terms of active investigations, the newer material will take precedence because those are likely the ones where children are potentially still at risk. So those will always kind of go to the top of the pile when we know that that's the case. We don't often know that at the beginning.
Have you ever met one of these victims after you've helped in an investigation?
Seeing as we're dealing with online crimes and the victims end up in being the final identification taking place at the local level, we don't often find ourselves in that position. The ICE units across Canada play a critical role in taking that kind of final step to make that approach on a victim or approach the parents and make that final confirmation based on the information that we've provided, perhaps in a case, to make that happen. So in those cases, it's really the local ICE units who have that one-on-one communication and meeting with either the victim or their parents or guardians. And then again, because there's such a range of types of offending, whether it's simply sharing amongst peers or sharing with an unknown online contact versus someone who has experienced ongoing sexual abuse that's been recorded and then distributed, or that they've been abused and then that material is shared within some of these bigger networks. There's a whole range of situations there that may require various types of follow-up with the victims and their families to make sure that they are indeed safeguarded from any future abuse.
Yeah, I don't know what it would be like to meet, somebody that's a victim of this type of crime, and you're such a integral part of it. And then, especially if you've been the one who has to review images or videos, I wouldn't know what to really think.
It's not. Even going back to that earlier file that I described about having to follow the offender and the victim into the woods, and again, I can only imagine for those that are doing that on a daily basis, it does add a whole other layer to the crime type. And unfortunately, we do find ourselves in a position where, you identify a child and, then you're moving on to the next and the next. And, it's daunting, but the work needs to be done. And thankfully, we have investigators across the country who are so dedicated in this field that we do get to identify these victims and collaborate and hopefully make a difference to those individuals.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I guess it kind of leads into the discussion of what type of mental health, we'll say, safeguards or maybe things that you get sent for. Do you guys have like a regular routine that you have to go see anybody or talk to anybody? Because I know even some of the units here in the Edmonton Police Service, they get sent for regular checkups, I'll call them. I don't know the proper terms, but
Yeah.
what do you do to kind of maybe take care of yourself?
Yeah, and that's definitely part of the equation in this crime type. It may vary between different services, but I know for us, we are required to, even before you enter this crime type, you have a psychological assessment, and things like resiliency is really important, and self care. And then once for us, we are required to get an annual. We do an annual check-in, kind of an assessment with psychological services, just to see how everyone's doing and how everybody's coping, and what those wellness things are in place to help mitigate the effects of viewing this material. And also here at the NCECC, our national center here, we have a research group and a health and wellness group who are regularly bringing in guest speakers and initiating wellness sessions and different activities to really help people find the tools that'll work for them in terms of their own well-being. Everyone's different in terms of what works for them and what will help mitigate the effects. So there's lots kind of going on at any given time for people to find the resources and the tools that'll work for them. But it definitely plays a big piece in this crime type for sure.
Does your unit have a tenure?
Yeah, so there's no specific tenure in place. I think most people, because we have that ability to meet with health services and have those tools available, it is a situation where if you're done, if you recognize that you've had your time is finished in this crime type, the process of moving on is made quite easy to help the person transition to a new crime type, a new unit, etc. So that takes a bit of the burden off of investigators wondering, what will happen if I leave or whatnot, because there's just as many risks to staying perhaps longer than you should. There's just as many risks with leaving too soon, in my eye, because people who get into this crime type, they're generally in it not because it's just another job. This is not the crime type that you take. I just want another position.
Mm-hmm.
I'm looking for a change. You do it because you're looking to make a difference. You're committed to the crime type, hoping to make a difference. So leaving too early sometimes can be just as bad as staying too long, I guess you could say. So everyone's different.
So, and we're just kind of coming up to the end of our time here, but where do you think you might go from here? Because you said there's a whole bunch of subsets in this field, but are you looking to stay in this area or do something totally different?
Yeah, it really depends. This crime type, just like many other kind of serious crimes type fields, whether it's missing persons or homicide and whatnot, one often complements the other in terms of the skill sets that you obtain. So I don't know exactly what will come next, but certainly still getting a lot of job satisfaction out of this particular unit, and hoping to continue to make a difference in some capacity. Right now I'm staying put, but we'll see what the future brings.
All right. Well, is there anything you think we missed? I know we were talking a bit before we started the recording, but I think we even touched on that stuff. Is there anything we missed?
No, I think the takeaway when we're talking about this crime type, because it's not an easy discussion to have, and we're certainly not in a position to talk about we wouldn't want to talk about the graphic details of these cases kind of in a public forum or in the media. So I think just one of the things to keep in mind, as whether it's you're a member of the public or media or police, is that because the details often aren't described for obvious reasons, we do have to be cautious that we don't oversimplify the crime type. I know there's some thought that child exploitation, we're talking about naked kids in a bathtub or naked kids running on the beach, and really that's not the case. I mean, we're talking about serious sexual crimes, suffering by these children, and I think I can end today just commenting on. I'll just quote the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child, who say that children have the right to live in dignity, free of all forms of sexual exploitation. And with those rights comes obligations and responsibilities that we must all honor and respect. And this is not optional.
Mm-hmm. That's good. Well, I think that's a great place to end. And thank you for your time. And if you can hang on the line, I'll say bye offline.
Sure.
But yeah, thank you for coming.
Thanks, Nathan.